Yo, everybody. Welcome to Off Panel, a weekly interview podcast about all things comics, brought to you by Sketch.com. I'm your host, David Harper, and this week's guest is the writer of comics like Judas, Nova, and Strange Skies. Well, I totally butchered that. Strange Skies Over East Berlin. It's Jeff Loveness. Thanks for coming on, Jeff.
Hey, how you doing? And don't worry, that title is a mouthful. It trips up. I still have not said it correctly.
Well, we're going to talk about Strange Skies quite a bit. I actually find myself calling it Strange Skies a lot, like it's an abbreviation.
Oh, yeah, much easier.
It's once you get into words 3 through 5 where things get a little dicey.
Yeah. And I think, you can franchise it better that way. It can be Strange Skies New Orleans,
or
Strange Skies Florida. We can just CSI it.
Yeah, I was going to go with NCIS, but I appreciate it.
Yeah. A lot of boat crimes on that show. But yeah, thanks for having me on.
This is I told you we're going to have tangents. This is an immediate tangent. I've never watched NCIS, but I don't understand how there can be enough naval crime for all of those shows. It blows my mind.
There's always some boat shootout that they have to solve. But yeah, especially like they have to franchise it to Los Angeles, and I don't know what's going on with the Navy. Yeah, they have a lot of problems apparently.
Sure. So I actually, like I said, we're gonna get into Strange Skies here in a bit, but I want to start at the beginning for you because, I'm always interested where people come from in comics, especially for, someone like you who is a comedy writer. You wrote for Jimmy Kimmel, Rick and Morty, et cetera, but you kind of have a very common comic book reading origin story in the sense that I read an interview where you said, I grew up reading graphic novels in Barnes & Noble waiting for my mom to come and collect me. And it's funny because I've heard that story from a lot of people. Like a Boom editor, Daphne Pleben, came on my podcast and shared a very similar story. My story was pretty similar, except it was in my local comic book shop in Borders. So when you were first, falling in love with comics, when you're first reading those in the I presume you were sitting in some sort of chair in Barnes & Noble. What was it that spoke to you about comics? What did you love so much about them?
Right. And first of all, I love Daphne. She's been a great help on this book as well.
Yeah.
Man, for me, I loved comic books ever since I was a little kid with my brother. And that X-Men cartoon in the 90s was probably the most definitive thing in my life. But then, I always had kind of an elementary knowledge of them, but it wasn't until I went to Barnes & Noble when I was in middle school, going in through high school, when you really got to read, you just got to sit down and do your homework. They had all those giant collected, Marvel Masterworks graphic novels. You could read all the Chris Claremont stuff. And then they also had, I think at that time, Grant Morrison's X-Men was in trade paperback, and that stuff felt almost like college-level reading to me. And
right.
What is going on here? What's happening with Cyclops? Why is he having why is Cyclops having such a mental breakdown? And Barnes & Noble is such a source of joy to me because my mom worked long hours. My dad had kind of rough hours during the recession when I was in high school. And so, I don't know, it was just it was like a shelter for me. And I really drew a lot of comfort and writing inspiration from it. And I guess I just think about Grant Morrison the most. I really loved reading his X-Men. I loved reading his All-Star Superman. Those are always the ones that stand out to me at that time.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because I don't really think about it very often, but sometimes I feel like comics are actually one of the essential things that develop my worldview in some ways. Not that I look at everything and I'm like, oh my God, I hope Sentinels don't attack or something like that. But, they affect you in a lot more ways than you imagine. But I guess one of the things I'm curious about with that being such an essential part of your childhood, how do you feel that comics impacted the way you look at not just the world, but also story? Because I know you've kind of always told stories. You had YouTube videos you create, you've done comedy and everything like that. Do you feel like there's been a significant impact from comics in the way that you view things like that?
As a writer, I think there's a lot of value in simplicity and accessibility. And I write for a show like Rick and Morty, which people think is so complex and complicated. And in many ways it is. But we are just at the core dressing up a lot of simplicity. We put a lot of thought into the basic story structure and the bones of the story. And I think comic books do that as well. So does the Bible. I was raised in a very, very small town of 200 people in a very religious family, kind of an isolating childhood. So I read a lot of the Bible and I got there's a lot of great story structure there. And I think comics and the Bible kind of share that. Any mythology would as well, Greek myth, Egyptian myth. And I don't know, I think it's been very it's been very rewarding and cool to see how all those like childhood stories have kind of come back and helped me on a professional level.
Yeah. Well, I actually think to a certain degree, obviously there's a lot of different reasons why like superhero stories have become so popular in movies and beyond. And I actually think what you're talking about is kind of at the core of that because there's like a purity to it. It's like I've had somebody say that comic books superheroes very much are modern myths. They are like the Greek myths or the Egyptian myths of today, where there's something super about it and there's something that people just connect with it because like you said, there's a simplicity to the story that people just really appreciate.
Yeah, there's a simplicity and there's an adaptability to it. So you can come at it from a lot of different angles. And yeah, I mean, it's just incredible that we're still telling stories about characters that were made in 1938. I
Right,
mean,
right.
and there's still something fresh to say about them. I think there's something very impressive about that.
I came across another quote from you that I thought was hilarious because it was, it speaks to like the disparate influences that affect people, like the storytellers that we know and love. And you said, everything I write is always going to have a touch of X-Men or Les Miserables in it.
Right.
And if you're talking about old school, I mean, I'm pretty sure Les Miserables is going even further back than the 1930s. I guess I don't even really have a question there. I just thought that was hilarious. I mean,
Oh, thanks. Yeah.
why those two things?
I really like the pageantry of Les Miserables, both like the musical, of course, but also the original novel.
Sure.
I'm a big fan of Inspector Javert. He's one of my favorite like repressed villains. I love a good sort of like sentinel villain that's always after you or clutching some deep secret within himself, and that definitely bleeds through into Strange Skies with the Kiner character. But yeah, I don't know. There's something about Les Mis that I always liked. I caught it right in college, and it just opened me up to something new. One of the first shows I ever saw when I was traveling a little bit. I don't know. I've always just got kind of a soft spot for it. It's just kind of goofy and big, but there's deep emotional resonance to it. Like it's by no means subtle, and in many ways quite bad, maybe. but I don't know. It's always in there somewhere. And same with X-Men. I guess I just love the messy vitality of X-Men. I mean, it's just so incomprehensible in many ways, and yet if you know the language, you can jump right into it. And there are so many pockets of it, and you can never really extinguish the fandom for any one character. Like there's always going to be, Jubilee fans or Skin fans or Pixie fans or Gambit fans, and they kind of ebb and flow. All like these like these weird little side tangents and side people, and like they're putting so much subtext and everything. I think it's just kind of a really fun world, and I've only gotten to write a little bit of X-Men, but it's always been so much fun to do.
Yeah. I mean, I think the perfect anecdote about how insane the X-Men really are is the fact that one of the most popular comic podcasts literally explains the X-Men.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, it's like
I could have used that.
yeah. I mean, it's very essential to the whole thing. I also like that you said that you like a good Sentinel villain, and then actually that works for both. You got Sentinels with the X-Men, and then so you have literally a Sentinel, and then you have your the one in Les Mis. I just think that's hilarious. But well, to talk about. I mentioned before you were a comedy writer. You've written for Jimmy Kimmel, Rick and Morty, Miracle Workers, associated or assorted awards shows like the Oscars and more. I think some people might look at that and be like, why? I mean, maybe even people you've talked to, like, why write comics? And that's, I guess, inherently suggesting that comics are perhaps a lesser medium. But what was it about comics that made it something that you wanted to do for yourself?
Yeah, it just kind of the opportunity kind of came across to do a couple short stories, and I was always just such a tremendous fan of comic book storytelling, and I thought I knew the characters quite well. And even when I first got my job at Jimmy Kimmel, I was 21 years old or something, and I was not really by any means like a polished, monologue writer or stand-up or anything. And I remember just those first few weeks kind of just thinking in my head, like, all right, like what would be like, okay, it's like a cheat. I was like, what would like Spider-Man say here? What's like a Spider-Man joke you can put into this as like a late night monologue? And like I've always had comic books kind of close to the comedy side of my heart too, because that was a lot of where I got my first comedy. I mean, Spider-Man in particular is such a like kind of a powerful character in my narrative life. But I don't know, it just always seemed like a natural progression of what I wanted to do. And I really like on the graphic novel side, especially in my original work, you're able to really fuse genres together and experiment with things. Like I doubt I'm ever going to be able to write a Cold War sci-fi horror movie like in within my comedy world experience.
Right.
But you can turn it around in about 8 months on the comic book side of things, and then it's real and it's in stores, and you can get to experiment and kind of push a different side of your writing capability. So I don't know. At first, it started out as kind of a fun exercise, but then it became kind of a chance for me to grow as a writer all on my own, and now it makes me kind of want to get more experimental on the comedy side of things. So I don't know. It's been kind of a nicely challenging symbiotic relationship so far.
I do think it's interesting when you look at your comic work versus, well, not all of your comic work, but you look at like Judas and Strange Skies over East Berlin, you see that, and it feels like it's almost like actively opposing your comedy work.
Right. Yeah. Yes.
It's like very serious stuff. Do you feel like, is that something you're actively pursuing because you don't have that opportunity to tell those types of stories with your comedy? Or is it just kind of what happens because those are the types of stories that interest, you feel like telling right then?
Yeah, I guess it's a little bit of both. I don't want to spoil too much of Rick and Morty, but I did like whenever it comes out, I think the next batch, next year or something, there's a lot of heavy genre stuff in my episodes. And it kind of felt like I was practicing on the comic book side of things to bring that back into the comedy side of things. But yeah, I think that is kind of a goal. I wanted a chance to do something completely detached from comedy and to kind of sink my teeth into new dramatic genres and not use comedic relief as like an exhaust valve or an escape hatch. I wanted to really, because I'm a comedy writer. I have a lot of comedy friends. We're kind of jaded people. We kind of most of comedy is just making fun of stuff and parodying stuff and pointing out tropes and all that stuff. And I kind of wanted to challenge myself to see like, well, what's it like to write in the trope and to write in the genre, but to not use a comedic release? Like, what if you actually have to, basically put your money where your mouth is? And that's kind of where Judas came from and Strange Skies and all that. So yeah, I don't know. It's kind of like a challenge to myself to see if I can write without sort of just the comedy bones in it, for better or for worse. Who knows?
I don't remember where this quote came from, but I remember reading something. I want to say it was from Alfred Hitchcock or maybe it was Stanley Kubrick. And they were talking about how situation changes like genre. Like if like a war strikes and you're in like a war room where you're like discussing everything, it's like that's probably like a political thriller. And if it happens and you're out on the actual battlefield, it's an action movie. But if it happens when you're in the bathroom, it's a comedy.
Yeah.
And I always thought that was a really kind of apt quote because it's a lot of times situations like, I'm guessing like a lot of the stuff that you write about in your more serious comic stuff is coming from like the same part of your brain as your comedic writing. It's just like you're kind of almost like twisting it in a sort of different way. I'm not saying Strange Skies could easily be a comedy, but I feel like it's kind of coming from the same place.
Yeah. It's all just the method of delivery, I think. And that's interesting what you say about Hitchcock, because I'm a big fan of Billy Wilder, and he was such a diverse director and writer. And did you ever see his Cold War comedy called 1, 2, 3?
No.
It's this really strange artifact of a movie, not really one of his more successful ones. It's a pretty standard like 1950s screwball comedy about East and West, and like, there's an American capitalist and his daughter falls in love with a communist, and they shot it right before the Berlin Wall came up. And so it is, and during production, like after shooting and during the edit, the Berlin Wall went up.
That
and
is
by the
insane.
time the movie came out, by the time this like lighthearted romp came out, the world had changed completely, and it was an absolute failure at the box office. And I think about that movie all the time from a comedic point of view or from anything. It's how like you just have no idea how things will be received, and you have no idea if the situation is going to change. Like, you can have the best timing in the world, but sometimes things don't work out. It's a miracle if anything works out. So I don't know. You just have to take a lot of shots and see what sticks, I think.
Yeah, I mean, that is really interesting. It like situation changes so much depending. I mean, it's like I don't know. God, I could go into some crazy dark places, but it is like, I always think it's fascinating how, a movie could come out, but if it came out like 3 months earlier, it might have been a blockbuster, but because like the way that people look at the world right now, it's like all of a sudden it's kind of a bomb because it's just, people don't want that kind of story right now because the way that the world is. It's fascinating how that changes things.
Yeah, and I think it's getting fat. The waves are getting choppier every day. So we
Absolutely.
have to. You just gotta trust your instinct, and if it doesn't stick, you gotta have three other projects going to kind of hopefully hit it right next time.
Well, we've talked about comedy and comics and how they kind of come from the same part of the brain, but I am curious as to you were writing comedy far before you were writing comics, excluding comics you might have written when you were a kid, which I'm guessing you probably did.
Sure, yeah.
Do you feel that writing comedy, whether it's for Kimmel or for anything else, prepared you at all for writing comics?
They it's kind of I always say it's a little bit of both in every answer, but like yes. And then writing comics made me a better comedy writer because of the economy of space and the
Sure.
need to keep things very tight and economical and to give everything kind of a cliffhanger at the bottom right corner of the page and to keep it moving. And the same way with comedy writing influencing comic books, like all of comedy is just setup, punchline, diverted expectation, callback, things like that. And it kind of works. I mean, maybe it's a bit of a reach, but it works the same way on a comic page. And like the pace of a fight or the barbs or I don't know, like it's all just timing and pacing and flow. And there's differences and like there's differences of delivery, but I don't know. I found that like the rhythm of it is basically all the same. You're just changing some words and thought balloons around.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, actually, I think that's absolutely true because some of the funniest comic writers I know are actually just absolutely hilarious in person. And I think a big part of that comes from the fact that you're exactly right. It's like when you read a funny comic, a lot of that stems from how the pacing is delivered and how like the cadence of the joke is told. And it's funny how like just the timing changes so much with anything that's funny or even anything that's just told in a story. It's if you change the pace just a little bit, it can tweak what you get out of it completely.
Yeah, and then I mean, I've been so impressed with writers like Chip Zdarsky,
Oh
who's
yeah,
able to. He's really incredible. I mean, he's so funny, but then like he just kind of adjusts a few dials, and then he really makes it a huge emotional payoff with his work. So yeah, I mean, I think you're on the money there. Like there's I think comedy writing sometimes gets put down as like a easier art form or like I mean it just kind of gets put into a box sometimes,
sure.
but I don't know. I think you can get a lot of diversity out of it.
Did you read Chip's Howard the Duck series with Joe Quinones?
Oh, not the whole thing. I've seen like I think I've just seen like panels online
Oh,
mainly, and
okay.
it's very funny. But yeah, I'm his Spectacular Spider-Man is
Oh
really
yeah,
good, I think.
yeah. That issue 310, like the final issue of his run, was like one of the most like I don't know. I think it's actually probably my favorite Spider-Man story ever, which is kind of
It's great. Is that the one the kids making the documentary about him?
yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Yeah, that's a great issue. Yeah, I really love it.
it's so good. And now, a quick word from our sponsor. Yo, everybody. As a listener to Off Panel, I'm guessing you love to hear how your favorite stories come together. And on Netflix's Behind the Scenes podcast, that's what you get, an exclusive look at how its biggest series are made. The podcast is back with a new season, giving us an exclusive look at The Witcher. As you might know, The Witcher is a new Netflix original series starring Henry Cavill that's based on Andrew Sapkowski's best-selling books. If I'm being honest with you, they pretty much had me at Henry Cavill, but any show mixing A Tale of Destiny with mutant monster hunters has me fully on board. The Behind the Scenes podcast will tell listeners how they turned nearly 3,000 pages of original material into this Netflix series. Host Brandon Jenkins talks with everyone from executive producers and writers to the cast and even sword masters who worked on the show. And if you're excited for The Witcher, this podcast is your ticket to an even better experience. The Witcher's season of Behind the Scenes premieres in mid-January with new episodes weekly. Subscribe now by searching for Behind the Scenes The Witcher in your preferred app. And now, back to the show. Well, let's talk about Strange Skies. I'm going to, give listeners a little breakdown of what it is. I'm just actually going to read the solicit for number one.
Please, yeah.
Herring is a disillusioned American spy stationed on the eastern side of the Berlin Wall, struggling with his role in a Cold War that seems to have no end. But when he's sent on a mission behind enemy lines to infiltrate East German intelligence, he soon learns the Soviets have a secret weapon that could change the tides of the conflict. An alien monster they don't understand and can't control. So it's you, Lissandro Estherren, Patricio Del Peche?
I believe so, yeah.
And Steve Wands. It's a great, very interesting series. We talked before about how both of us are pretty fascinated by that time period, the Stasi, all that stuff. But You know, I've seen the list of influences that went into this. It's just an absolutely bonkers quintet of stories that I saw listed. The Lives of Others, which makes sense. It's a a paranoid story told on the eastern the eastern side of the wall. Cold War sci-fi like Solaris and Stalker, but then also paranoid body humor like Alien or The Thing. So. I'm always fascinated by like these type of like genre. I don't want to say genre mashups because that feels like, I don't know. It feels, I don't know, diminishing. But what are the origins of this story for you? Like, where did it first come together?
Yeah, yeah, and no, I don't think genre mashups are diminishing at all. I think that's kind of where the fun of it comes from. I
Yeah.
mean, that's that's where Alien comes from. That's where The Thing comes from. Any of that stuff. Yeah, I don't know. I think I wanted. It started from a place of I really love doing Judas with Boom, and they want to do something else. And I was just trying to think of like what would be the opposite of Judas. And I'm like, okay, it's like kind of a dark religious epic. Like, what's okay? We'll do modern day or a different period. I'm like, okay, yeah, that's good. Like, what's the opposite of like religion? I mean, I guess sci-fi. I mean, it did come from a very basic place of like, what's the opposite of Judas? And but what's so I secretly I want to tie the themes together to Judas, and then there's an earlier comic I did called World Reader for Aftershock that I kind of wanted to carry through themes of loneliness and connection and like sci-fi despair and all that. So it was very much like a theme first kind of book, and then I mean, I'm just such a big fan of 20th century history, and you just listed off all the references, but I love like Tarkovsky sci-fi. And I was writing this before Chernobyl came out,
Oh
and so
man,
I
yeah.
thought I thought I really had a leg up. I'm like, oh yeah, I love like that Soviet wet concrete like aesthetic, and oh yeah, I haven't seen that in a while. I'm gonna go with that. And then I see Chernobyl out, and at first I was upset, but I'm like, oh wait, no, this actually helps. It'll really like elevate the aesthetic so people recognize it. But for me, it just came from like my love of history, my love of like restrained existential sci-fi, and then also just my love of like themes of guilt and secrecy and sort of that Les Miserables sort of intensity and pursuit. I don't know. It all just kind of became a big soup for me, but it was really fun. And
Yeah.
I wanted to treat it like a John Le Carre thriller that gets broken by the fifth page. Like you think you know how it's going to go. You've seen this movie before, and then that giant double splash just like rips the movie apart, and you don't know what you're in for.
You totally just blew my mind. Is that how you pronounce John Le Carre? I always said John Le
Ooh,
Car. I have no
oh,
idea.
oh, no, no. I am always, like I said, grew up in a small town.
Okay.
I feel like I always mispronounce things. So
No,
I'll
no.
take yours. I don't know what it is,
I
but
went with
yeah,
like the most basic possible pronunciation of it. I'm like, John Le Car. Yeah, I know this.
you might be right. I think let's go with yours. But yeah, Spy Who Came In From the Cold, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I love those types of stories, and I love stories on post World War II. I actually I just find anything that was basically from World War One until like kind of like the last 20 years, like those types of stories involving anything involving Russia is really fascinating because it's such like a paranoid, just frightening place. It just they had no interest in the truth besides their version of the truth, which typically was not really reflective of the truth.
No, I mean, I'm right there with you. I think Cold War history, specifically Russian history, is beyond fascinating, and Russia really has like the character arc of the 20th century, along with Germany. I mean, it's just the sheer amount of sacrifice and tragedy that went into the USSR. You read anything from like Vasily Grossman, or I was reading this Joseph Stalin biography last year. It just we have it pretty. I mean, America has horrific problems and things to really focus on and work on. But man, like Russia in the 40s and 50s, that was pretty rough.
Yes,
But
yes.
so I don't know, and I always just like kind of lifting up the perspective and putting it in another spot. And I think we sometimes overlook the plight of like, man, the Iron Curtain was a while ago, and we kind of and now we're in a world where we talk about uh, jailing refugees and keeping people trapped or putting up walls to separate people, and it's just kind of a tragedy that's coming back as any sort of acceptable argument. Because we look at that old world and what a tragedy it was, and how many quiet lives were snuffed out or broken or sabotaged or betrayed because of that wall. And I don't know, it just struck me as a very as a big narrative, like a monument to stage the story around. And then, like I said, to rip it up at about 5 pages to show that no, like this thing is not as big as we think it is. There's something bigger out there that we have to really get to the bottom of. I don't know. It just seemed like a very exciting kind of jumping off point for the story.
So you kind of like reverse engineered your theme in a way. It was kind of like you're like, okay, I want to go directly opposite of where I was before. But when you have a story like this, when you're trying to sort of reverse engineer it, do you have was there a first beat that entered the mix? You know, was it the Stasi story or the alien story, or did it just kind of all come together once you had the theme?
I think I wanted to do. I mean, this is just basically lifting lives of others. I think that's one that Stasi agent in the lives of others is one of the most fascinating characters in a movie that I've ever seen. Like, if any of your listeners are looking for a good sort of East German conspiracy movie with a lot of heart, I would recommend The Lives of Others. I always thought that was such a tragic character, and like I said before, I love Inspector Javert. I'm a big Cyclops guy and from X-Men. I just kind of I like a nice reserved tragedy within a man. And I don't want to give too much away because that'll go into issues 3 and 4 and all that. But I thought I had an interesting villain on my hands with a little bit of a Magneto tint to him or something. Yeah. And then on the protagonist side of things with Herring, I sort of, and I'll have to let the readers see if they agree with me or not. But because this will go into issue 3 and 4, I sort of wanted to write a protagonist who was not the protagonist and who really wasn't maybe deserving of all the narrative empathy that usually protagonists are supposed to have. Mm-hmm. And I really wanted to like push it further than Judas, to where like I think we did a pretty good job of sympathizing Judas in the first 2 issues, and then it kind of goes from there. But I kind of wanted to almost lie to the audience and treat him like, yeah, we've seen a lot of spy movies. We know a spy is down on his luck. We've seen Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, stuff like that. But I kind of wanted Herring to get like more and more skittish and more detached from the audience and more like I don't know, unlikable. The story went on as his past is revealed, and I don't know, it just became kind of a chance for me to play a little bit of chess with the protagonist, the antagonist, with this sort of otherworldly threat, like kind of closing the noose tighter and tighter on their minds as they're stuck in this bunker. That's a big tangent, but that's basically what I was trying to work with.
I think Herring is a great character. It's really fascinating though, because I feel like he really should have been caught by now. But
sure, yes.
But there's a part of him, like I almost feel like the Stasi agents probably relate to him, because basically his entire life is a lie and their entire world is a lie. So they're like, oh, you're clearly one of us.
Right. I always thought that. I'm so glad you picked up on that. I always wondered. There was a line that I really liked, and I thought Patricio and Lisandro really hit the loneliness of it, to where, like, if you're a Stasi agent and you're just taking documentation and you're listening to people all day and you're making reports that are just full of lies to tell the truth of whatever the party wants to like report on, what are you even listening for? I mean, are you even listening for the truth? Are you trying to even just remember what it sounds like? Like, it just seems like the worst form of busy work spread across an entire nation. And just, I thought the despair and the emptiness of it would be really interesting. And yeah, I guess Herring should have been caught by now. I guess he's got a good accent or something. He's on top of it.
I mean, it actually seems like life there would have been, it's almost like you're constantly trying to pass a rigged test that you don't know the answers to, and only they do. And it's just like, you have to pretend as well as you possibly can. This is a super random question, but I mean, I guess, I suppose you wrote it, so you probably know what I'm going to be talking about when I talk about this. But, in the first issue, there is a 2-page spread, a double-page spread, in which the alien, ship comes across the Berlin Wall, and it's this big wide spread, and the only words on it are "The truth finds you." It's on the left side of the page, and it's really interesting. It's kind of a recurring thing that happens in the book, in which you use spreads. You and Lisandro and Patricio and Steve use spreads in really fascinating ways, where the text is just basically completely broken out from any normal elements that you would expect from a story. Like, there's no speech balloons, there's no box, there's nothing like that. It's just put into like the shade of the page. Was
Right, right.
I'm interested in how that type of thing came to be. Like, was that something? Was that a beat that you envisioned in your head, or was that something that maybe Steve brought up, or what's the origin of something like that?
Right. Steve's been doing an excellent job. He's we kind of give him a little bit of push and maybe I'll mention a spot to do it, but man, he's really brought such he's made the font and the text and the kind of the thoughts of the alien or the intrusive thoughts like a character of their own.
Right.
I think the origin we sort of did a similar thing with the scripture in Judas. Like anytime there's basically a Bible verse or sort of the words of Christ or something like that, we sort of had them lift off the page, and we just found that to be a very impactful use of it.
Totally.
And it's basically like a trick we just picked up from Judas. And I'm like, well, that's very interesting. If we're using, the alien as this sort of otherworldly, unreliable narrator, and then Herring himself is also an unreliable narrator, why don't we make the narration kind of a visual element of the story just beyond little like caption boxes or whatever? And then that just became really fun because it made it seem more dangerous. Like the secrets were kind of leaking out into the page as people's minds are going and stuff. And yeah, I mean, I've been very impressed with what Steve's been able to do. And I think issue 4 has a lot of good stuff like that.
It adds a lot of potency to those beats. It's like when you get to that page and you see that it's almost like the combination of the alien craft crossing the Berlin Wall plus that bit of text. It's just it is like a perfect marriage of text and art, which is what comics are. But it's interesting though because it is very off the typical standards for what a comic is, and I found it to be really striking because of that. Sometimes it's like when you get away from comic norms, it can not work because it'd be hard to read. But that worked because it was such a specific call out.
Yeah, and I think it's cool that like working with Boom, they're not like one of the big two, but they still have really good editors over there who kind of get that since they're more of an indie publisher, we're able to experiment a bit more and push a bit more. And yeah, I mean they were all about that, and they understood that like the encroaching narration, reliable or not, was also going to be kind of a character in this. And so yeah, once we nailed down that visual look, I think it's given this book kind of an extra kick.
Yeah. So I guess speaking of Boom, you've talked about how much you enjoyed working with them on Judas. Was a lot of the reason why Strange Skies ended up there? Was it because you had comfort working with them and you knew that their team would basically do everything they could to realize this book to its absolute max?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Eric Harburn, he's the main editor over there, and he was my editor on Judas, along with Gavin Grobenthal and Daphne Plebin's kind of been jumping in and out as editor. She's got a million other books that she's doing.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, I was so comfortable working with him, and Judas was probably the biggest risk of all of this because I was just coming off of straight comedy credits, basically.
Right.
And so, like, Eric took a big swing on me there, and then I think he just had such a good time that we wanted to do another one. And yeah, I mean, Boom's been a good place for it. I mean, I've done one original over at Aftershock as well, but I think I'm pretty happy with Boom. If depends on how this series lands, I think I'd love to do something else with them down the road.
I do like, because it sounds like they kind of brought Lissandro on board and in the rest of the art team. I do like how they've managed to complement the story, like with the people who have been brought on board, because Lissandro is an absolutely perfect fit for the book.
Yeah, no, and that's all Eric. He's such a student, and he's so tapped in, and he is the one. He brought Jacob Rebelka in for Judas, and he brought Lissandro and Patricio in for this. And yeah, I completely agree. They have elevated this thing and given it almost like this Belgian, like the pencils of a Belgian comics, and then like a little bit of like a watercolor splash. Like it's really, I'm just floored. I kind of want my words to get out of the way, just to see all like the fog and cobblestone and street and shadow and all that.
You got to tell Steve that he could take care of that. He's just like delete.
Yes.
Well, I mean, and beyond that too, I tweeted about this, and it was. I actually think that the covers are some of the best covers of the year, not just because, I mean, Evan Cagel's doing the main covers, but also there's, Tansi Zonjic did a cover for the first one. I think, was it, God, who did the second one? Oh my God, I completely spaced it. The variant cover. But anyways, I mean, the cover artist, it was Gabriel Hernandez Walta.
That's it. And then Raoul Allen did
Yeah,
the issue 3. Yeah. No,
yeah.
it's incredible. Go ahead, but yeah, they're incredible.
Well, I was just going to say, but beyond that, like one of the things, like the secret power, and I've actually found this on Boom Books a number of times. There was this book that Ian Colbert and Dan Abnett did called Wild's End that was just
Hmm.
tremendous as well. And their design team is fantastic. And the stuff that they've done, particularly on those variants, Tansi's one, where like it almost felt like a textbook cover, but
Yes.
it made it
Yeah.
feel like a real history piece. Maria Corpina is the name. It appears to be the designer of the book. I mean, just fantastic stuff. But what do you feel that? I mean, I guess like how do you feel like all the art team, what their impact is, and how they elevate this story to make all these big beats land?
Yeah, I mean, the art team deserves the full lion's share of all the credit for this book because they have, like you said, they have truly elevated this thing. And I was pretty involved with the initial talks of what I wanted the cover aesthetic to look like. I sent over a ton. Again, I just hit the Tarkovsky well a lot, but I looked at all the covers for Solaris, international posters for Stalker, The Man Who Fell to Earth. It's all very restrained and a little muted with a lot of surrealness to it and sort of bleakness and harshness. And then and then through the variants, like the variant for number 1, like you get kind of a bit of a nice like paperback throwback, like you were saying, that sort of helps to misdirect the Cold War spy thrillerness of it. But then you got Evans, who are a bit more experimental and surreal, that kind of get into the creepy sort of mental energy of the piece. And then I really love Raoul Allen's for number 3. It's just a little bit of almost like pop art or a little bit of like
Yeah.
graffiti spray to show like the broke, kind of the shattering mind of Kiner. I that's been my favorite part of this whole thing. I mean, like you've got Patricio and you've got Lissandro just like, killing it on every page, but then man, those covers by Cagle are just killer. And it was we did go back and forth with a lot of different styles trying to nail things down, but once I finally saw that cover from Evan, I'm like, oh yeah, that's absolutely it. And now I think the book is going to work. Once I saw that first cover, I thought, okay, yeah, I think we got this.
Did you, I mean, when you were initially talking with Boom and discussing the book and everything like that, did you have kind of a vibe that you wanted to go with visually, like to match the tone? Because that's one of the things, if you had the wrong artist on this book, it wouldn't work in the same way because it's such a
Yeah.
tonal book.
Yeah, absolutely. And my writing at times, I'm sure, is a little on the nose or a little melodramatic or whatever. So we needed an artist who could really, like you said, like sell the visual terror of it and really let those beats land and all that. And yeah, I mean, we just talked for a long time about how I just wanted it to be dark and stripped down and really just like psychologically kind of twisted and jagged. And I mean, again, all credit to Eric for pairing me up with Lissandro. But yeah, I've been floored by the art. It's like there's a panel in issue 1 when Herring is just walking around Berlin and his face is a little obscured. He's looking at all the people out there. And man, Lissandro just evokes this vibe on the page that you just can't trust anyone just with a single image. And he I don't know what I did to deserve him. The guy is good.
Well, I mean, not to, take away from all of your artist credit, but I will say, like, the thing is I feel like sometimes when people come into comics, when a lot of times people actually, I think I saw somebody today, like, there's Darcy Van Polgeest who did Little Bird for Image, which is a fantastic comic. He was talking about how he was kind of getting some guff from a reviewer because he was a movie director or like made films and stuff like that. And sometimes when people from comedy or movies or TV shows or whatever come into comics, like it's almost like some comic fans feel like it takes away from some of the purity of it. It's
Right.
invasion of the comedy writers.
Yes, yes. And I always wanted to be pretty, I wanted to make sure that I earned my spot. And yeah, like it seems, there's always someone, the comedy writer jumps in and do like an issue of Deadpool, or they let someone write, like a Star-Lord series, or, whatever. I'm just throwing out random things. But yeah, it does always seem like, oh, we tossed a TV writer a bone. And I never wanted to seem like that. I wanted to treat it like I don't know, I just wanted to kind of prove my spot and show that, like, yeah, this isn't like a fun little dalliance for me. I really love comic books, and I really wanted to show that I could jump in and, like, not just do a funny version of a character or like a funny little, Nightwing story or something. I just wanted to jump in and really show that, like, no, like, I love this genre and I want to make a go of it. And yeah, hopefully I've earned my spot, but who knows?
Well, what I was going to say though is I actually feel, and obviously this isn't your first project, but one of the things that really impresses me about your writing is that, I've talked to people who say that, for first time writers, sometimes one of the biggest problem is you have a tendency of overwriting in,
Yes.
in comics, because you forget that there's going to be an artist also telling the story. It's just like, oh, you have to say that they're going to be turning the doorknob because that's how you would do it normally. But in this case,
Yeah.
there's an artist who can do that. The script for Strange Skies Over East Berlin is impressively restrained. And I don't mean that in a way that you're just like absentee or something, but you've really got the pacing down to accentuate all the tone. I mean, that's really like the tone setter. And I think Lissandro and all of them do a great job of amplifying it. But, the combination of your script with Steve's choice to, for like the narration is almost written in like a typewriter
Yeah.
font.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just, I don't know. It's just like I said, it feels you're like a vet already, Jeff.
Oh, thanks, man. That's nice of you. And well, I'm sure you should read the first draft of my scripts, and then there's a lot of repetition, there's a lot of captions, and I think that's what you just mentioned is right on the money. Like when you're especially writing like dramatic pieces or genre pieces, I for sure, especially with this and with Judas, I did a lot of first person narration, and so it's very humbling when the art comes back in and you're at that final lettering stage and you're like, oh yeah, I can take out half these captions. People
Right.
get it. He's a spy, he's in Berlin. Okay, yeah, he's sad. Okay, we get it. And so I really love that stage of it, to where like you lay down the blueprint, you lay down the script, they come back with layouts and their take. You kind of have a little bit of a conference over that. But yeah, once that art comes back and they lay those panels in and you lay your captions in, you're like, oh yeah, they did most of the job here. And now it's my turn to kind of set the tone, dial it back. It's that old Brad Bird anecdote about like the building's on fire, just take what you need. And I really like that stage of comic writing. It's very like, it feels like you're just doing like fine, like finished work. It's really fun.
Do you feel like, I don't know if you've ever written Marvel style, but I feel like Marvel style might speak to you to a certain degree.
Oh yeah, I've done a little bit of that over on Nova. That was mainly, script driven, but every once in a while I would just toss it over and like that, the artist was so good on that. So
That was Ramon Perez, right?
Yeah. That Ramon was awesome, and so like, and he was a co-writer on it as well. So it was a nice way just to say like, okay, let's do a double page spread, and you have some fun with this. I'll lay down a few bullet points, and then I'll write around the action that you're writing. Like that was kind of my closest experience with Marvel style. But yeah, I dug it quite a bit.
Mm-hmm. I am always really fascinated by how much books change during like lettering drafts, because it is substantially different seeing a comic in script form versus seeing your words on the page. Like, do you find yourself, like you said, when you're going into the lettering draft, you're like, okay, now I know I can remove this and I'll be fine, and I can tweak this and it'll be good. Like, is that an important part of the process for you?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's maybe one of the most important ones, especially for me, where I get a very anxious or a very very detail oriented at the end, and you think every little thing's going to destroy the book or whatever in your head. And so I really love that final edit stage. It's the same with comedy writing. It always just comes down to like the exact phrasing of a word, and you've got to, and what order do you use, and you really labor over it for far too long, because it doesn't really matter except to anyone but you. But yeah, I really love that stage. And even at Rick and Morty, I mean, we're re-editing and we're rewriting that thing up until the end, and it's fun to really just see how much, I don't know, if the art side, and especially even in live action with you're working with actors, how much your words change because a specific actor is saying them a certain way or the camera's conveying it a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's, I guess, exchange, or that not to sound cheesy, but like that conversation is kind of the most exciting part, because you see that like, no, you're not God. Your script is not, you can change this thing around. And in fact, it's a good thing. You see what artists bring to it, and you see what the actors bring to it. And your job is just kind of to flow with it and to make it, something. And then you all kind of come to like this third place that's kind of the best of everything.
Yeah, I mean that's I remember one thing I reference a lot is Kieran Gillen wrote something on his site about how he and Jamie McKelvey worked together.
Oh yeah,
and he was talking about how I think it was actually in regards to comic reviews and kind of how people look at, or reference the way that they work, and like sometimes they'll be like, oh, Kieran made this decision, but in reality it was actually like Jamie that did that. And he described them as really like a faux cartoonist, like in about how that, I always think about that when it comes to comics, is a lot of times it can be difficult to attribute where these decisions happen and who's the one who's actually driving it. And sometimes it's like, your script could make Alessandro make this decision, and then you see what his decision was with the art, and then you change the script right back. It's like you said, it's a conversation.
Absolutely, and that's one of the most exciting things. I think with to go back to Judas for a second, like the idea to give Judas this sort of black halo around his head, I believe was an art decision that Jacob made, and maybe Eric pitched it as well. And like I didn't even think about that, and yet that was from their visual sensibility. Like that's one of the more defining parts of the book. And yeah, the same here. Like we had to go back and forth over the age and the look of Kiner, and I rewrote the ending 2 or 3 times. And then I realized I was writing too much, and I needed to lean on the visuals, and the visuals will help me decide how much dialogue to put in. And yeah, like it's made me a very it's really helped me become a more collaborative writer, which then helps my other comedy work as well. So yeah, it's my favorite part of the stage. Except when you realize like no wait and then even if you make a wrong call, you still have a chance to kind of write your way out of it. You can always add a couple more panels or a couple more melodramatic captions explaining what exactly is going on in case you didn't do it well the first time.
Sure. Well, I wanted to actually ask about, we were talking before about how there's certain parallels with the world today. And it is really fascinating because, I think that it is widely considered that the Stasi was bad. I think that we would probably all agree upon that. But it is, as you pointed out elsewhere, it is really fascinating how we look at secrets and privacy today versus then. Because, like I said, the Stasi was bad, but now we've basically willfully Stasi'd ourselves, if you can turn Stasi into a verb. Because of like, you noted before, it's like you have, an Amazon Echo. I have an Amazon Echo. There's actually an Echo Dot sitting like 2 feet to my left, so I'm probably going to be abducted by jackbooted thugs here in a minute.
Oh, and we pay for it. I paid to have my privacy violated by one of the worst corporations in the world because I wanted to listen to music while I chopped vegetables. Like it's we've kind of really sold out our privacy in the name of convenience and to capitalism itself. Whereas back then it was more of like state controlled, government secrecy over everything. Now I think, we do it out of convenience and kind of subservience to capitalism. So I don't know, things don't change as much as we wish they would. And then, with this book, like it became pretty clear that the parallels were going to be overt. And so I tried just to kind of keep them simmering on the stovetop instead of just deliberately like hitting them over the head with a hammer. But I think that works hopefully pretty well to where like
it does.
And like I don't know, like the time period has more than enough interesting stuff to say for itself. And then I just try to kind of leave it open, especially in issue 3 when it gets a little more dramatic or specific. Like I don't know, I feel America hasn't been called out for it's very easy to look at the Stasi, and it's very easy to look at the Soviet Union for all their, of course, horrific crimes and the stain on history that they left. But I don't know, like the U.S. is still there as well. And like, you just look at South American history, you look at Vietnam, or, we've had the luxury of having our own bias. And now with a bit more of a complicated world on the horizon, it's fun to kind of dive into the American side of things and say, we may have won the Cold War, but I don't know if we kept ourselves as, clean as we wanted to in the process. But I don't know. It's been a fun book to sort of write about the ideas of the time without having the burden of specifically writing about the time.
Yeah. I mean, presuming that you don't finish the series with Herring saying, wow, I sure hope we learned a whole lot from this while staring
Yes.
directly out from the panel. I mean, you're handling it really well. I mean, honestly, like the parallels are there, but it's never overt. It's not like you're trying to push that. It's fascinating. I actually, the other night, because Disney Plus is easy thing to fall into, and fittingly another corporation that is taking over our lives. But you look at Captain America the Winter Soldier, which is my favorite Marvel movie, and it's really fascinating to watch that. And you see, like, they're talking about Hydra, and they're saying about how we tried to take the world by force of will effectively, and it didn't work, and so we basically just made it so the people needed us. And then they like tried to take over that way. Like they just kind of reverse engineered their own their humanity's subservience. And I guess in some ways, like that's kind of how the privacy shift worked too, because it's like, we don't have anybody forcing this stuff upon us. We're just kind of Trojan horsing it into people's homes in under the guise of convenience and ease. It's like the Ring stuff. My wife was interested in that, and then I sent her an article, and she was like, "I don't know about that anymore. That seems a little sketchy."
Aldous Huxley was right. The Brave New World or all that. Like we do more out of pleasure than we will ever out of subservience or mandatory law or whatever. Yeah, it's going to be an interesting problem of the 21st century, I think, to see how do we, if it's possible at all, to dial it back, or is that Pandora's box open forever?
Is that so? Is the kind of parallel themes, is that something you think of as you're writing, or are you just telling the story and then you're just kind of like, not a lot has changed?
I don't know. It's a bit of both. I guess I've always just had, like, I went to Germany to kind of study and go to some Stasi stuff and to look at some old DDR stuff. And I think it just kind of developed naturally while I was there, that it didn't seem as different as we think. And, they just got a couple more wires and a couple more, radio transistors inside of shoes or whatever. But yeah, I don't know. I think it was just something that came naturally. And I wanted to keep the story focused on the kind of cerebral alien terror and the spy craft. But then, yeah, it became easy to kind of gently layer those things in, in the middle of giant alien telepathic attacks or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, I actually, just the alien thing too. I mean, it is really interesting because you have a very natural parallel there as well. You have this culture that's obsessed with secrets, and then the alien comes, they're like, sweet, how can we weaponize this? And it's like, it basically just reveals all the secrets. And
right.
It's a really it's a very nice parallel. It's kind of it's a culture that's finally getting what they want, but they're drinking from a fire hose with it.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, I'm so glad you picked up on that. And I think even just from the design phase in the beginning, I think I was coming up with this around the time like Bird Box or A Quiet Place were coming out, and
sure.
If Quiet Place is about sound, Bird Box is about sight. I was just thinking I wonder if you could do something with thought, and then that led me directly to the Cold War era, where secrets are currency, and what do you do when your currency is suddenly just exposed by something that's far beyond you? And then I had so much fun playing with the otherness of it, and I love the monster movies that don't explain that much, and it's just the mystery of the unknowable horror, like that first Alien movie or The Thing or Under the Skin, I think does a really good job. That creature at the end of Annihilation is so cool.
Oh, yeah.
Just to kind of play on that gives you just enough, but then maybe also don't satisfy you at the end, because the character is not really going to know. I always hate it when they find some alien security cam footage that shows exactly what the thing is or whatever.
Yeah.
I always love the joy of just I don't know, man, that was just a weird thing. And you just gotta get out of that little Arctic base or jungle observatory or whatever. There's no time to figure out that much. John Voight's never going to show up and tell you the entire thing.
Yeah. I mean, it is fascinating when you look through the history of stories and how many stories really stand out in our memories because you never really know. It's the one I always bring up is the Pulp Fiction briefcase. It's if you knew what was in there, it would not be nearly as rewarding. Or I mean, for an example of something that you're actually given an answer to, it's I think that everyone loved accepting that being a Jedi was like a cool thing, and being like force, having the force
Right.
is just like an interesting thing that you don't necessarily need an answer to. And then you find out it's midichlorians and you're just like, I don't know if I needed to know that.
Right. There was so much more power in the unknowable kind of magic of it. Or
Right.
there was some, yeah, like some just elixir that was beyond your understanding. Yeah. When it became something you could measure, like a liter or a quart, it's not as good.
Yeah. Well, I just had one more question to close. I think we've kind of touched on this, but I always, looking at your career, I think of your dichotomy between comics and your comedy as like this interesting split, because, like I said before, you kind of push against what you normally do with your comic writing. Do you ever have editors who, I mean, not that they're actively being like, hey, you want to put a joke in there or anything like that, but I mean, do you ever find that they maybe pigeonhole you because of what they already know about you, or do you feel like that's something you're largely able to escape?
I think they used to. I mean, I love working for Marvel and DC, but I think clearly I was kind of seen as a comedy guy, from the beginning. Like we would have said earlier, I would have been like one of those late night TV writers that they would have asked to do like, a funny MODOK issue or something like that.
Right.
And I'm really, and like those are really fun. And I've written a couple of them and like I really like them. I did this one about like Venom fighting Wolverine last year. That was just such a joy. It was such like just 8 pages of Wolverine and Venom fighting in a bar in the 90s. That was fun. But with Boom especially, and Aftershock was the first to do it. Like yeah, they were never too crazy about that. They understood that like comics are a place to really explore and experiment and broaden your horizons. So like luckily they haven't really had, no one's given me notes to punch up Judas with like a sidekick character or something. Like it worked out pretty well. And now I feel like I'm really lucky to where I feel pretty secure on the comedy side of things with Rick and Morty, and hopefully all these other projects coming out soon. But then I feel like I got some good sea legs on the comic side of things, and so now maybe my next one will be a comedy. I don't
Yeah.
know. I want to see, see if there's something I can do.
I do think it's interesting how, you know, it feels like you're almost kind of like dealing with the modern world in two different ways. Like, when you're writing for Jimmy, I had Daniel Kibblesmith on my podcast and we talked about
Oh
this a
no
little
way!
bit too. Yeah. And when you are kind of always having to face what like the world is in like a comedic way, you're always trying to find the humor in it. And I wonder almost if it's, like I was saying before, it's almost like you kind of are rebelling against that concept with your writing for comics, where it's just like, you have to be able to confront that in a multitude of ways. And maybe that's how it manifests itself in your writing of comics. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think it's kind of a tragedy. I think of the new world in which we're in, whereas like so much of our attention is taken from us without our consent. I mean,
Yeah.
and so much of it is just driven by addictive market forces in our phones, or just if you're in the comedy world, especially, you are under constant pressure to know what's happening and to have a take on it. Even news items you don't care about, or things that like I just felt that way in late night. Whereas I loved late night. I loved doing sketches. I loved making jokes about the day and commenting on America. But then I found like I wasn't telling anything of lasting value. It was just gone the next day. And maybe there's a sketch that did well on YouTube, but I just didn't feel like there was anything really like holding us to it. And I wonder if people are going to look back on this decade as just kind of an ephemeral narrative decade. I don't know. But I don't know. The comic writing came from my place of maybe insecurity in my comedy experience, to where I just wanted to do something that kind of lasted a little bit. And maybe that's what drove me to do Judas first, because that's as timeless as you're going to get. That's kind of,
Yeah.
as long as there's Christianity, I suppose people are going to know who Judas is.
Right.
And then I guess with this one, I just wanted to do a period piece, like sure, like set in the past, but I don't know. I just kind of wanted to do a more timeless is maybe not the right word, but yeah, something just definitive, and it didn't have to be tethered directly to the present moment, but it could comment on it. But you could also, hopefully read this story in 5 or 10 years, and it's not going to be dated because there's like a Trump joke in the middle of it or something.
Right.
So I don't know. I think you just always kind of got to dance between those raindrops, because you want to be current and you want to say what it's like to be alive right now, but you don't want to fall into the trap of just trying to chase that Twitter dragon every day, because no one is going to remember that, there's going to be another, I don't know, another dragon the next day. That's a powerful analogy. I really landed that metaphor well at the end.
I know I, for one, will constantly remember the day that Elon Musk revealed his truck and all the jokes that were told.
Right. Yeah.
Maybe not. Maybe not. But I will say that I do think it's fascinating how, like you said, like let's say you put like a Trump joke in like a comic or something like that, and then probably in like 10 years, it's going to be like, oh man, that was a waste. But you can tell a story that's set, 60 years in the past, and it can feel fairly timeless. Yeah. You can tell a story about pirates, and it's just like, oh, this could, this works wherever. And
I think so. Yeah, absolutely. Like I was reading East of Eden maybe a year or two ago, and there's a paragraph in that defines the Trump era, I think, better than any other book that's been written. Any contemporary book you can shake a finger at. Same with like Marquez's Autumn of the Patriarch. The final page of that makes such a definitive statement against autocracy and the Trump era. Like, I don't know. I think people have been through more than we think, and right. We always like to think that we're at the tip of the spear as far as like society, but I don't know. I think these things have a way of cycling around. So if you just make a comment about right now, odds are, if you make it in a timeless enough way, odds are it's going to circle back again, and people will have, they'll see themselves in it. But who knows?
Yeah, well, absolutely. Jeff, that is all I have for you. Thank you so much for coming on and chatting about Strange Skies Over East Berlin and everything else.
Absolutely, man. Thank you. Thank you for putting in the time. This is a great interview. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel with writer Jeff Loveness. You can find him on Twitter at Jeff Loveness, on his website at jeffloveness.com, and his work in Strange Skies Over East Berlin at Boom Studios. As a heads up, Off Panel is once again brought to you by Sketch.com. Check out the new version of the site and consider subscribing for access to all of the site's content and its members-only forum. If you're a fan of Off Panel, make sure to check it out on Patreon. If you back the show in there, you not only support it, but you get early access to each week's podcast, access to weekly content, and more. Also, don't forget to subscribe to Off Panel on iTunes or Spotify and give the show a rating or review while you're at it. You can find Off Panel and Sketched on social media by liking it on Facebook at /Sketch, that's SKTCHD, follow it on Twitter at @SketchComic, or following me at @SlicedFriedGold. Big thanks to all my existing patrons, including Chris Pachalo, Torrent Groenbeck, Fuzz Bubbles, Christopher Todd, Transmitter Down, Harry Sayer, Waltz Comics and Books, Carl Mizell, Danny Ollie, Paul Salates, Litwin Studios, Akil Wilson, Nathan House, Alex Dimitriopoulos, Terry Dodson, Troy Jeffrey Allen, Leona Kingus, Keegan Ray, Milton Lawson, Wesley Gibbs, Sean Kirkham, Harry Small, Alistair Ross, Julio Anta, Brett A. Schmidt, Jason Goodmanson, Paul Reinwand, Connor Farner, Vita Yala, Aditya Bidikar, Tara Ferguson, Dave Sletcher, WMQ Comics, Akil, Kokachi, Phil White, Ben Becker, Sean Pinello, Ken Heidelman, Philip Seavey, Al Ewing, Ryan Alcock, Nick Michelin, David Kelly, Robert Wilson IV, Nick Polito, Owen McCree, Brendan Fletcher, Gary Maloney, Jonathan Nilsson, Matthew Groom, Jason Massey, Adam Bogart, Xavier Files, Matthew Taylor, Tyler Turner, Nick Patera, Jacob Sorelli, Ford Gilmore, David Baraldi, Ira James Udaskin, Modern Magic Stories, Nick Hall, Bjorn Basin, John Hendricks, Steve Anderson, Ian Maxfield, Cliff Chang, Benjamin Shipper, Colin McMahon, Chris Palmer, Scott McGovern, Nathan Fairbairn, Kat McKenzie, Greg Rucka, Adam Highfield, Fiona Staples, Chris Hallren, Mark Abnett, Mike Murphy, Michael Shirley, Tom Barnett, Jim Demonacos, Norbert, Nicolo, James Kaplan, and Mission Comics and Art in San Francisco. You guys are all the best. A quick thanks to Upright T-Rex Music, who wrote and performed Off Panel's theme song just for the show. Check out their music on Spotify because it's completely delightful. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for another episode.